December 7, 1941. The flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, flagship of the Kido Butai. The air is electric with a tension built over decades of ambition, grievance, and meticulous planning. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this is the day they will seize their destiny. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leader of the first attack wave, looks down at the Hawaiian island of Oahu, a sleeping green jewel in the vast blue of the Pacific. Aboard the battleship Nagato in Japanese home waters, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of this audacious gamble, waits for the signal that will change the world. The entire operation is a masterpiece of naval precision, a secret six-carrier fleet having sailed over 3,500 miles across the storm-tossed North Pacific in complete radio silence. Their target is the heart of American power in the ocean. They intend to make their own, the U.S. Pacific Fleet, nestled in the shallow, placid waters of Pearl Harbor. At 7:53 local time, Fuchida's voice crackles over the radio with the legendary code words, Tora, 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 Tora. For the Japanese commanders listening, it is a moment of supreme triumph, the culmination of a strategy years in the making. The doctrine of the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, is about to be realized in a single shattering blow. Their plan is not just to damage the American fleet, but to annihilate it, to send its mighty battleships to the bottom of the harbor, thereby buying the Empire of Japan 6 months, perhaps a year of uncontested freedom, to expand its dominion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. In that year they will fortify a defensive perimeter so vast and so powerful that a demoralized America will have no choice but to sue for peace. The mathematics of their victory are simple and brutal, measured in tons of steel sent to the seafloor. Below Fuchida's aircraft Battleship Row is a picture of serene peacetime routine. The great ships, the pride of the U.S. Navy, are moored in pairs along the shore of Ford Island. Their crews are at Sunday morning colors, preparing for church services and a day of shore leave. The sound of a bugle call drifts across the water, then the sky fills with the roar of Nakajima B-5N Kate, torpedo bombers and Aichi-D, 3 Alval dive bombers, their engines screaming, the red Hanomaru insignia on their wings glinting in the morning sun. The first torpedoes, specially fitted with wooden fins to allow them to run in the shallow 45-foot depth of the harbor, slice through the water. They strike the port side of the USS Oklahoma with a series of thunderous percussive shocks. The great ship, weighing over 27,000 tons, shudders violently. Within minutes she has listed so far that her mast and superstructure are digging into the soft mud of the harbor bottom. In less than 12 minutes, she capsizes completely, trapping over 400 of her crew in a dark watery tomb. The USS West Virginia, moored outboard of the USS Tennessee, is struck by as many as 7 torpedoes. Her port side is ripped open like a tin can. Only the quick heroic counter-flooding actions of her crew prevent her from capsizing like the Oklahoma. She sinks on an even keel, her main deck awash, fires raging through her superstructure. The USS California, hit by 2 torpedoes and a bomb, fights for 3 days against progressive flooding before finally settling into the mud, her flag still flying. But the most iconic image of destruction is reserved for the USS Arizona. At approximately 8:10, a 760-pound armor-piercing bomb, a converted naval shell, is dropped by a high-altitude Kate bomber. It strikes the Arizona near her forward turrets, plunging through multiple decks before detonating in her forward black powder magazine. The result is not an explosion, it is a cataclysm. A fireball erupts hundreds of feet into the air, and a seismic shock wave rips through the harbor. The forward half of the battleship is obliterated, lifting out of the water before crashing back down. The ship is broken in half and sinks in less than 9 minutes, taking 1,177 of her crew, nearly half of all the American lives lost that day with her. She becomes an instant tomb, burning for 2 days, a pillar of black smoke that serves as a funeral pyre for the old US Navy. In Tokyo, in Berlin and aboard the returning Japanese fleet, the news is met with celebration. The reports are breathtaking: 4 American battleships sunk, another 4 damaged, hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. The Japanese High Command is euphoric. They believe they have won the war in its first hour. They have decapitated the US Pacific Fleet and secured their empire. The American battleship, the symbol of naval power for half a century, has been proven obsolete, swept from the board in a stunning display of Japanese air power. For the Japanese commanders, these sunken ships are monuments to their victory. They are dead, finished relics of a defeated enemy. They could not possibly imagine that for the Americans, these wrecks were not tombs, but cocoons. They could not comprehend that America's greatest weapon was not its fleet of battleships, but its industrial soul, its bottomless capacity for resilience, and its sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. They celebrated the sinking of the ships, never once considering the possibility that America would simply send them back to war. December 8, 1941, Pearl Harbor is an underworld of twisted steel, iridescent slicks of fuel oil, and the stench of death. The smoke from the Arizona still hangs heavy in the air. The harbor is a graveyard. Of the 8 battleships present, only the USS Pennsylvania, in dry dock at the time, has suffered relatively minor damage. The Maryland and the Tennessee, moored inboard and protected by their sister ships, are also damaged but afloat. But the Nevada is beached and burning, and the California, West Virginia, and the capsized Oklahoma are all resting on the bottom of the harbor. To any rational observer, the scene is one of absolute and final devastation. But America is not rational at this moment, it is enraged, and into this scene of devastation steps Rear Admiral Homer N. Wallen, the newly appointed salvage officer for the Pacific Fleet. Wallen is not a man given to despair. He is a naval constructor, a man who understands the language of stress, strain and steel. He looks at the wrecks not as tombs, but as complex engineering problems. His assessment is stark, but determined. In his first report to Washington, he famously concludes, "The entire salvage job is unprecedented in naval history. But I want to state, and with emphasis, that these ships will be salvaged and repaired." Around him, his staff is overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disaster. Wallen looks at them and says simply, "Gentlemen, let's get to work." Thus began the greatest salvage operation in maritime history, an effort that would become a symbol of American industrial might and relentless ingenuity. It was a filthy, dangerous, and often heartbreaking job. The first priority was the recovery of the dead. For months, divers descended into the dark, oil-choked interiors of the sunken ships, a nightmarish world of floating debris, tangled wires and jagged metal. They worked in zero visibility, navigating by memory and touch, to bring their fallen comrades home. Simultaneously, the work of salvage began. The mathematics of the task were staggering. The USS California, for example, had been flooded with an estimated 50,000 tons of water. To refloat her, every single leak had to be found and sealed. This was a job for the divers. These men, a mix of Navy personnel and highly skilled civilian contractors, were the unsung heroes of Pearl Harbor. They would spend hours underwater, their heavy copper helmets and canvas suits their only protection, breathing air pumped from the surface. The water was so thick with fuel oil that it dissolved the rubber seals on their suits and coated their skin with a greasy film that took weeks to wash off. They worked with pneumatic tools, cutting away wreckage and drilling holes for bolts, their vision often limited to a few inches in front of their faces. The core of the salvage effort was a deceptively simple but incredibly complex piece of engineering. The wooden patch. To seal the massive torpedo holes, some over 40 feet long, the engineers designed and built huge custom-fitted patches made of heavy Douglas fir timbers. These were not simple planks, they were complex structures, curved to match the hull of the ship, reinforced with steel, and lined with canvas and oakum to create a watertight seal. On the surface, hundreds of civilian workers and Navy Seabees, the newly formed construction battalions, worked around the clock in hastily assembled workshops, cutting, shaping and assembling these massive wooden cofferdams. Each patch was a unique engineering project, designed from blueprints drawn up by divers who had taken painstaking measurements of the jagged holes below. Once a patch was built, the truly perilous work began. It would be floated into position over the hole, and then the divers would descend to wrestle it into place. They would guide the multi-ton structure, battling currents and underwater obstructions, until it was perfectly aligned. Then, using long heavy-duty bolts passed through the hull, they would slowly tighten the patch against the ship, compressing the seals until the flow of water was reduced to a trickle. For the California alone, over 200 such patches, large and small, had to be installed. With the major leaks sealed, the next phase began, dewatering. A fleet of massive industrial pumps was brought in, their thick hoses snaking down into the dark holds of the ships. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to pump the water out. It was a tense, dangerous process. As the water level dropped, the pressure on the patches increased. Divers had to be constantly on hand to tighten bolts and plug new leaks that appeared. The engineers watched their calculations with bated breath. If a major patch failed, the ship would be violently reflooded, and months of work would be lost. As the water was pumped out, a scene of incredible devastation was revealed. Compartments were filled with a thick, foul-smelling sludge of oil, seawater, and decomposing material. Every piece of equipment, from the delicate electronics in the fire control rooms to the massive turbines in the engine rooms, was coated in this corrosive muck. Teams of sailors followed the dropping water level, their first job being to defuse any live ammunition they found, a task of unimaginable stress. Then came the cleaning. They used steam hoses, solvents and sheer brute force to scrape away the filth, revealing the machinery beneath. It was a race against time. Every hour the salt water remained. It was eating away at the complex heart of the ship. Then, in March of 1942, came the first great moment of triumph. After months of patching, pumping and praying, the USS California slowly, groggily, lifted from the mud and floated on her own keel. A cheer went up from the hundreds of men who had worked on her. It was a small victory in a vast ocean of war, but it was a deeply symbolic one. A ship that the Japanese had written off as a total loss was alive again. The West Virginia, sunk in even deeper water and with far more extensive damage, would take until May to refloat in an even more complex operation. But what of the Oklahoma, the ship that had capsized completely? To any other navy in the world, she was a hopeless case, a write-off. But the U.S. Navy was determined. The salvage of the Oklahoma was an engineering feat that bordered on the miraculous. An expert from the Merritt Chapman and Scott Salvage Company, Captain F.H. Whitaker, was brought in to lead the effort. The plan was audacious. They would attach 21 massive steel cables to the hull of the capsized ship. These cables would be run over huge wooden structures, called righting bents, built on Ford Island. The other end of the cables would be connected to a series of enormous electrical winches, salvaged from construction sites. Over a period of 3 months, these winches would slowly, painstakingly, pull the 27,000-ton battleship upright. The process, known as parbuckling, began in March of 1943. For months, the winches strained, the cables groaned, and the massive hull of the Oklahoma rotated, inch by agonizing inch. Finally, in June she was upright, a gutted, ravaged hulk, her decks and superstructure completely destroyed. She would never fight again. Her damage was too extensive, but her salvage was a testament to the sheer stubborn will of the American salvage crews. She had been brought back from the dead, if only to be sold for scrap. It was a message to the Japanese: there is nothing you can destroy that we cannot rebuild. This entire salvage philosophy was completely alien to the Japanese military mindset. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, a ship that suffered heavy damage, especially in a forward area, was often stripped of any useful equipment and abandoned. Their industrial base, already stretched to its breaking point, simply did not have the spare capacity for massive complex salvage and repair operations. They lacked the heavy equipment, the highly skilled civilian contractors, and most importantly, the mindset. Their doctrine was focused on offense, on the perfect decisive blow. The grinding, unglamorous, and incredibly difficult work of repair and resurrection was not part of their calculation. They had sunk the American battleships, and in their minds, that was the end of the story. As the salvaged battleships were refloated and patched up enough to be seaworthy, they began a series of perilous slow-motion voyages across the Pacific to the great naval shipyards of the American West Coast. The USS California, her massive torpedo holes covered by the gigantic wooden patches, was towed to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington. The West Virginia and the Tennessee made their way there as well. The Nevada, after temporary repairs at Pearl Harbor, steamed under her own power to Puget Sound. The Maryland and the Pennsylvania went to Mare Island Naval Shipyard near San Francisco. Their arrival in these shipyards marked the beginning of the second phase of their resurrection, a transformation so complete that the ships that would emerge would be almost unrecognizable from the ones that had been sunk. This was not just a repair job, it was a total rebirth. The arsenal of democracy was about to demonstrate its true power. The shipyards of the West Coast were beehives of activity, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Tens of thousands of workers, welders, riveters, electricians, engineers, many of them women who had never set foot in a shipyard before the war, swarmed over the wounded giants. The first step was to strip them down to their bare bones. The entire superstructures, the mangled nests of bridges, masts and gun directors, were cut away with torches. Thousands of tons of fire-damaged, waterlogged equipment were ripped out and sent to the scrapyard. Then, the rebuilding began. These were no longer going to be the slow pre-war battleships designed for a different era of naval combat. They were going to be rebuilt for the new reality of the Pacific War, a war dominated by air power. The most significant change was the addition of a massive anti-aircraft battery. The old ineffective .50 caliber machine guns were replaced with hundreds of state-of-the-art 20 mm Oerlikon and 40 mm Bofors cannons. The Bofors gun, in particular, was a marvel of mechanical engineering, a water-cooled power-operated weapon that could spit out 122-pound, high-explosive shells per minute, each one equipped with a self-destructing fuse. A late-war battleship would bristle with up to 100 of these guns, capable of throwing up a wall of flak so dense that it was suicidal for any enemy aircraft to fly through it. But the guns were only half of the equation. The other half was the revolutionary new technology that would allow them to hit their target's radar. The old optical rangefinders were supplemented and eventually replaced by a suite of advanced radar systems. The large SK air search radar could detect incoming enemy aircraft at ranges of over 100 miles. The smaller SG surface search radar could spot enemy ships and even the periscopes of submarines. And most importantly, the new Mark 37 gunfire control system, with its iconic Mark 12 radar antenna, could lock onto an enemy aircraft and automatically feed targeting data, range, speed and altitude, directly to the Bofors guns, which would then track the target automatically. It was a closed-loop system of destruction, a marvel of analog computation and electromechanical engineering that was light years ahead of anything the Japanese possessed. The ship's main batteries, the massive 14-inch and 16-inch guns, were also completely overhauled. Their old cage masts were replaced with modern tower structures. Their armor protection was improved, and their internal subdivision was enhanced to make them more resistant to torpedo damage. The ships that emerged from the shipyards in late 1943 and 1944 were in effect brand new vessels, wrapped around the core of the old hulls. The West Virginia, for example, emerged from Puget Sound so radically altered that she was barely recognizable as the ship that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor. She was wider, bristling with guns, and packed with the most advanced electronics in the world. She was slower than the new Iowa-class battleships, but she was now one of the most powerful and survivable warships on the planet. While this industrial resurrection was taking place, the nature of the war in the Pacific had changed. The great naval clashes that the Japanese had envisioned, the decisive fleet actions, had largely been decided at the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, where aircraft carriers, not battleships, had been the key players. A new kind of war was beginning, a brutal island-hopping campaign, a slow grinding advance across the vast distances of the Central and Southwest Pacific. And in this new war, the old slow battleships, the very ships the Japanese thought they had eliminated from the equation, would find a new and vital purpose. They were to become the floating heavy artillery of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. Their first major return to combat was in the unlikely theater of the Aleutian Islands in mid-1943, where the repaired Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and Nevada provided fire support for the landings on Attu and Kiska. But it was in the bloody amphibious assaults of the Central Pacific that they would truly prove their worth. At Tarawa in November 1943, the Tennessee and the Maryland were part of the pre-invasion bombardment force. For hours they pounded the small island, their massive shells churning the landscape into a moonscape. They were joined by the other repaired battleships in the subsequent campaigns, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Peleliu. Their new role was brutal and methodical. Days before a marine landing, the old battleships would arrive offshore. They would be assigned specific sectors of the beach and the island's interior. Then the systematic destruction would begin, working with aerial spotters and naval gunfire liaison teams that would go ashore with the first waves of Marines. The battleships would pound enemy fortifications with a terrifying accuracy. Their 1-ton armor-piercing shells could smash through the thickest concrete bunkers. Their high-capacity shells would detonate with a massive blast, clearing entire trench systems. For the Marines huddled in their amphibious tractors, waiting to hit the beach, the sound of those big guns firing over their heads was, as one veteran put it, the most beautiful music in the world. But the ultimate moment of redemption, the scene that seemed scripted by a god of irony, was to come in October of 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. The Japanese, in a last desperate gamble, had committed their entire remaining fleet in a complex three-pronged attack to destroy the American invasion force at Leyte. The Japanese Southern Force, under the command of Admiral Shoji Nishimura, was tasked with sailing through the Senegal Strait to attack the vulnerable American landing ships from the south. Waiting for him in the darkness of the strait was the American 7th Fleet Support Force, commanded by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, and under Oldendorf's command, drawn up in a battle line that stretched across the northern end of the strait, were 6 American battleships. 5 of them, the West Virginia, the California, the Tennessee, the Maryland and the Pennsylvania, were survivors of Pearl Harbor, ships that had been sunk or damaged and left for dead by the Japanese 3 years earlier. The 6th was the USS Mississippi. Oldendorf, a master of naval tactics, arranged his forces perfectly. He had his PT boats and destroyers attack the Japanese column as it sailed up the narrow strait. Then as the surviving Japanese ships emerged from the gauntlet of torpedo attacks, they were met by Oldendorf's battle line, perfectly positioned to cross the T. This classic naval maneuver allowed the American battleships to bring all of their main guns to bear on the approaching enemy ships, who could only reply with their forward-facing guns. At 3:53 on the morning of October 25, the newly installed, state-of-the-art radar on the American battleships picked up Nishimura's flagship, the Yamashiro. The American ship's fire control computers calculated the solution. Then the order was given. The main batteries of the resurrected American battleships roared to life, sending a torrent of steel and high explosives down the strait. The first salvo from the West Virginia, fired from a range of over 12 miles in complete darkness, straddled the Yamashiro. The Pearl Harbor survivors had their revenge. In the ensuing slaughter, the Japanese Southern Force was annihilated. The battleships Yamashiro and Fuso were sunk with almost all hands. The dream of the Kantai Kessen died with them, sunk by the very ghosts the Japanese thought they had created. The shock in the Japanese high command was profound. They had known through intelligence reports that some of the American battleships had been repaired, but to have them appear in a single powerful battle line and exact such a perfect, crushing revenge was a psychological blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. It was a demonstration that their initial victory at Pearl Harbor had been a catastrophic miscalculation. They had not understood their enemy. They had mistaken a single tactical victory for a strategic one. They had focused on the hardware, the ships themselves, and had failed to comprehend the software of the American system, its industrial capacity, its engineering genius, and its unyielding resolve. The resurrected battleships would go on to fight in the final brutal campaigns of the war, at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Here they performed their final vital role, acting as floating artillery platforms, pounding the heavily fortified Japanese positions for weeks on end, their guns firing until the barrels were worn smooth. And then on September 2, 1945, came the final symbolic act. In Tokyo Bay, as the instrument of surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri, another battleship was there, anchored in a place of honor. It was the USS West Virginia. The ship that had been hit by 7 torpedoes, sunk in the mud of Pearl Harbor, and left a burning wreck, was there to witness the final unconditional surrender of the Empire of Japan. It was the ultimate testament to the failure of the Pearl Harbor attack. The Japanese had celebrated the sinking of a fleet, only to have that same fleet sail into their home waters to accept their surrender. The story of the Pearl Harbor battleships is more than just a tale of salvage and repair. It is a metaphor for the entire American war effort. It is a story of a nation that was knocked down, but refused to be knocked out.
It is a story of how a democratic industrial society can absorb a devastating blow and come back stronger, more determined, and more technologically advanced than before. The Japanese commanders, in their moment of triumph, had believed they were witnessing the end of American power in the Pacific. What they were actually witnessing was its birth. They had poked the hornet's nest, and the hornets had not just rebuilt their nest, they had turned it into a fortress of unparalleled strength, and sent it across the ocean to exact a terrible and final price.